vermin, there would be bugs. She said, I doubt that even if there's anything there, because these books are going to have a lot of leather linings, that there would be anything salvageable. And Mary said, I'll tell you what, you've been very, very good to us. If there's anything in that barn, it's yours. You can have it. 12 seconds later, Francis Glenn was on a train, headed for Iowa City. Now, what did he find in the barn? Do you suppose when you opened the door? You already know, don't you? The barn was full of books, so tightly packed that they were in perfect condition. Tightly packed, you know, you couldn't get bugs and dirt and vermin into them. Maybe the ones on top had gotten wet, but they were all okay. The most of it. Also in the attic of the sister's house, they discovered full of books. For example, a complete set of the congressional record, including the congressional record before it was known as the congressional record, all the way back. And Mary laughed. And she said, oh yeah, I forgot about those. She said, sometimes if Teddy couldn't get to sleep at night, he would pick up a copy of the congressional record. And that would do it. The books went back to Kansas City, and sure enough, the hole is all filled. The library is all complete. Moves the books. Now, from here on in, I'm going to skip around. Just because it's a little easier. When Francis Glenn comes back, and he's walking through the house with Lloyd Chapman, the attorney, who obviously don't go with him, they're chatting, and they're up in what we would call the attic, which would be the third floor of the house, except it was a 2.5-story house. And the attic was finished. In other words, it had a floor. And in that room, they're walking around, and of course it's full of stuff. And as they go through the attic, chimney comes up through the floor, through the roof, brick chimney, of course. And this chimney would have been there for a long time, 70, 75 years. And a chimney of brick, when the house was built like that, they would build a brick chimney, then they would stucco over it, probably with cement or something, so it would be smooth. But a chimney like that would not have had much of a liner or anything else. So as it's heated in the winter, heating, cooling, expanding, contracting, through many years, that concrete would just begin to fall down around it like dust. Around the chimney, there was just a dust, accumulated concrete dust and so forth. And Francis Glenn is over there kicking in the dust, and he discovers 2 stacks of magazines, sort of things, pamphlets, tied up with string. And what they turned out to be was the Saints' Herald, which is the earliest publications of the Mormon Church. 4 bundles of them, the only copies known anywhere in the world, the Saints. Now, at that time, the University of Nebraska, where he was the librarian, had discovered that Fitzgerald had taken down to the university about 20,000 volumes of his library and had intermingled them with the university's books. And so they tried to go through the collection and return to the estate of those books that they knew weren't theirs. So they'd gotten back. Now the estate was ultimately to receive $53,000 on the book sale. But another thing that Francis Glenn noticed as he went through this attic of the house was down towards the west end, probably under kind of a gable, was we would call it a closet, but it would have been probably 12 foot by 12 foot, something like that. And on each side were big, like bins, not shelves, but bins, where they would have, and these were built into houses at that time, where they would have stored what they call sheet blankets. These would be, in the summertime, you take these heavy flannel sheets and so forth out and store them up there. This room was, interestingly, not full of books, but rather on the floor, there were several stacks of newspapers opened out flat, about maybe 4 feet tall. So immediately, Chapman says, this must be the newspaper collection. He said, nope, it's just newspapers. There's new newspapers, old newspapers. There's Lincoln newspapers, there's New York newspapers. It's just newspapers. He saved newspapers. And he said, so those will just have to go to the dump, because there's nothing there. So again, the state papers, which I've got copies of, show that they hire someone to come from the salvage paper to look at them. They buy all of the newspapers and magazines to be recycled. You know, recycling even in 1952. And they bought 65 tons of magazines and newspapers to be recycled. They couldn't touch the newspapers up in the top room. And I always figured, well, because it wouldn't be easy to get them out of there. But I read further and I say, no, that's not the case at all. For example, what they do is they bring dump trucks up and they around the house and they just shovel the stuff out into there. Now, when all of the books are out of the house, they're wanted in Kansas City, and they discovered to their dismay that the other 90% aren't worth anything. Long's bookstore, remember them? Long's, Mr. Long is invited in. Ernest, this would be Ernie's father. Ernest is invited in and told that he can buy anything he wants for 1.25 cents a piece. And he told me he bought as many books as he could store, and then he quit. And then the rest of them went with the newspapers that weren't saleable to the dump. And at that time they couldn't salvage, they couldn't recycle books because they could not get a hardbound book, for example. It has glue and you couldn't recycle it. But what they could do, they were sending books out to the penitentiary. With a drop leaf, they could cut off the spine in the hardback books, but it wasn't economically viable. So those books went to the dump, 79 dump truckloads of books. Later on, we know of a man, Professor Milan's side, who's still with us. As far as I know, he came to the last time I gave the lecture, and I've talked to him over the years many times. Milan has got to be in his 90s. And 2 years ago, he was still driving, which is kind of scary. But at any rate, he was pretty sharp. And he told me that when I mentioned this to him, he said, well, newspaper's up, and he says, yeah, I know what that was. And he said, and I also know why they couldn't buy them. It wasn't because they were on the third floor. It was because when the guy from the salvage paper place went up, he picked up the top newspaper. And there was weeds, he said. Look, he said, there's a newspaper, and there's weeds. There's a newspaper, and there's weeds. He said, this isn't going to be worth our time to separate the weeds from the newspapers. Off to the dump. Milan South said that was his private herbarium. He says now, in the 1950s and 60s, he said at that time, that late after his death,